Get out of your seats. Put your hands together all the way in the back. I want to hear you. Help me welcome to the stage Dr. Ben Hardy. Everybody, keep it going, make some noise.
When I was 11 years old, my parents got divorced, and the divorce threw my father into an extreme depression. And he ended up becoming a terrible drug addict from age 11 to age 19. And from those years, I felt like my father was a villain. I blamed him for my problems, and life was not good. I actually barely ended up graduating from high school. Now, I want to tell you something. I could go into all the details, but I want to tell you that that is not actually a true story. It may be a true story, but it's not my story. The truth is my father is not a villain. My father is my hero. This is him with my son Rex, named after his father. This is him with my daughter Jordan, him with my son Logan. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is three things: your identity, your time, and your leadership. And before I go into how you can 10x your future, you really have to learn how to 10x your past. If you don't gain mastery over your past, over your frame, and over how you filter your story, you won't be able to operate from your future. I actually came to this conclusion just a week ago. Last week, a huge podcast that I was on went live, and it got hundreds of thousands of views, hundreds of thousands of listens, and I was getting all sorts of amazing adulation, and I got a phone call from my mom. And my mom said, "Ben, that was amazing. It was a beautiful podcast, but there's just one problem. The way you talked about your dad. You talked about how he was a drug addict. You did talk about how it happened for you, not to you, but you didn't finish the story. You didn't tell the true story. You didn't talk about how he was actually our hero. And so never again will I tell the story that way again." Here's a quick quote from one of my favorite psychiatrists. His name is Gordon Livingston. I recommend you write this book down. It's called Too Soon Old, Too Late Smart. So here's the quote. "The stories of our lives, far from being fixed narratives, are under constant revision. Each of us have latitude in how we interpret our own histories. We have the power to idealize or denigrate the characters that inhabit our life stories. We are all able to color our past either happy or sad." So this is what it takes to go 10x. This is the cause of the 10x effects. First, it's identity. We're going to go deep into that. Second, it's time. Your time is fundamentally about the quality of your attention. How deep is your attention? One of my favorite people is actually in this crowd. His name is Dr. Alan Bernard, and he is one of the top researchers in the world on a topic called constraint theory. I quoted him multiple times in 10x is easier than 2x. Dr. Bernard, I love you. Thank you. I'm going to share a few of the most amazing nuggets from this man in a second. But one of the core bottlenecks of human beings is our finite attention. And you cannot go 10x in quality and in mastery unless you go very deep and let go of everything that's good in your life. You have to go for what is great. In fact, last week I had a conversation with one of my mentors, and he told me something very hard to take. He said, "Ben, right now, you are only good. You are not great." He said, "You're not great because you're still trying to do two things. You can be good at two or more things, but to be great, you have to let that stuff go." One of my favorite quotes: "We are kept from our goal not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal." There are lesser goals that are holding you back from going great, and your attention has to go deep so that you become 10 times better and that's what leads to 10 times bigger. The final component is leadership. So let's go into identity. Let's talk about how you develop mastery over your past and mastery from your future. Not towards your future, from your future. So this is the typical way of looking at time. This is an inaccurate way of looking at time when it comes to psychology. Most people, if they want to explain the present, they do so by discussing the past. It is not accurate to say that the past determines the present. From a psychology standpoint, it is far more accurate to say that the present determines the past. That's what I just barely told you. The story of my father. It is always in the present that you shape the past. Here's a quick quote from my absolute favorite psychologist, Dr. Brent Slife. And then I'm going to explain to you how you can master your past, how you can continuously recognize that you are not your past self, not even a week ago. You're not the same person you were a week ago. And I'm going to give you some time to do some reflection and show you how you can master it. Here's the quote from Dr. Brent Slife. He said, "We reinterpret or reconstruct our memory in light of what our mental set is in the present. In this sense, it is more accurate to say that the present causes the meaning of the past than it is to say that the past causes the meaning of the present. Our memories are not stored and objective entities, but living parts of ourselves in the present. This is the reason our present moods and our future goals so affect our memories." So the psychology of time is not sequential. The past is not behind you. The past is not dead. It's not even past, as Faulkner said. The future is not up there. Psychologically, the past, present, and future are happening right now, which is why all of you are actually having a fundamentally different experience listening to me. You are all framing this conversation and filtering it based on how you view your past and how you view your future. Case in point, when my kids started getting really into Teslas, they started to see them everywhere, right? In psychology, they call that selective attention. In self-development, they call that reticular activation system. That has to do with your goals. Your present is filtered by the future that you most want, but also by the past that you're most attached to. So mastery over your past means that it's not the past that determines the present. It is always the present that determines the past. One thing that's very important to note with this is that the past is absolutely not a firm foundation for making choices in the present, because the present is a different situation than the past. And as I will show you in a minute, the present is not a firm foundation for creating the future. It is always the future that is the foundation for creating the present. So here's how you start to develop mastery over your past. And then I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time. I hope you have something to journal on. If you don't, just grab your phones. I'm going to give you just a few quick prompts. The first thing to know about mastering your past is that it is always the present that determines the past, not the past that determines the present. The arrow going from the past to the present puts you in the passenger seat of your own experiences. It is always the present that shapes the meaning of the past. And you can either have a past that is a liability, meaning that it is sucking and draining your present and your future, or you can have a past that is an asset that continues to pay your present and future over and over and over and over. This gets to the core of what identity actually is. What is identity? It's two things. It is your story, and it is your standards. The story of your past, present, and future selves, but also the standards, and more directly, your minimum standard. You can know what your minimum standard is by what you say yes to, and more boldly and more directly, what you say no to. And when you start transforming your past and start evolving beyond your past self, and once you start making your 10x future self the standard, you will immediately begin saying no to a lot of the things that were amazing even a week ago, because the future is the filter for the present. The filter and the standard are the same thing. There's one other component to mastery of your past, and that's that you always recognize that you are not your past self. You don't have any negative emotions towards your past self, though. You only have compassion and love and empathy for your past self because they were not you. They don't know what you know now. But if you don't recognize the difference between your current and your past self, then likely you are still operating as your past self. Even though you are not that person, you're still clinging to that story. So you are not the same person you were 10 years ago. Think about that for a second. I'm going to just give you a quick jog. Who were you 10 years ago, back in 2013? Did you have the same worldview, the same goals? Did you have the same situation? You probably didn't. But I will argue you're not even the same person you were at the beginning of this year. You don't have the same perspectives. Maybe you've even accomplished things this year that your past self at the beginning of this year would have thought were impossible. Raise your hand, actually, if any of you, the person you are now, has achieved or experienced anything that just the version of you at the beginning of the year would have thought were impossible. How many of you have done that? There you go. Your past self had no frame of reference for what you now have normalized. So let's go ahead and start. If we could have some quiet music, I'm going to give you guys 90 seconds for about 5 separate sequences of time. So go ahead and play the music. Pull out your journal if you can. First question: what is the biggest growth and change you've experienced since 2013? So go back to that. Go back to 2013. By the way, me and my wife Lauren were living in her parents' basement at this point in time. I didn't even know I was going to be an entrepreneur back then. So you got 90 seconds on this. What are the most important forms of progress you've had? Important wins, important changes since 2013, but also, how are you different from who you were in 2013? If I was to talk to the 2013 version of you, or the version you are today, how different would those conversations be? Biggest forms of progress and growth, but also, how are you different from who you were back then, 10 years ago? You might think in terms of your floor, right? What is your floor now? What was your floor then? Is there a timer, by the way? I don't see it, but that's okay. Take another 30 seconds on this one. Biggest change in who you are today versus who you were 10 years ago. Remember, it is always the present that filters and frames the past. So what I'm inviting you to do is to filter the past based on how you are different from your former self. Second question, 90 seconds here. What is the biggest change and growth you've experienced since 2020? So 3 years ago. Go back to 2020, wherever you were, beginning of the pandemic. What is the biggest forms of progress and change that you've experienced? But also, how are you different from who you were in 2020? Take 90 seconds to mess with that. Will you keep playing the music? $30 more seconds here. How are you different from who you were 3 years ago? What things are now normal to you that would have been inconceivable to you 3 years ago? This could be personal, it could be professional. It could be in how you relate to your wife or your kids or your husband. It could be how you relate to your team. It could be that you had no team back then. All right. Now go back to January of this year. What are the biggest forms of change and growth you've experienced in 2023? But also, how are you different from that person? What were you focused on at the beginning of the year? What was your definition of success? What was your floor in terms of your minimum standard? In terms of what you said yes to that maybe now you absolutely would say no to? Just one more after this, I think. It is always the present that determines the past, not the past that determines the present. Please remember that. That is where you become anti-fragile. Framing and filtering is your identity. The frame, which is the story, the filter, which is the standard. 40 more seconds. Write down the biggest wins you've had, the biggest growth, maybe the biggest obstacles that you've overcome so far this year. Write down the things that you've done that took courage that maybe you did not know you could do. Maybe write down the things that you've let go of that you were absolutely attached to at the beginning of this year. It could be a certain form of income, it could be a certain idea or a story. What have you let go of that maybe would have felt impossible to let go of at the beginning of this year? 17 more seconds. How are you different from your past self at the beginning of 2023? All right, go back to the beginning of September. What the heck has happened in September? What are some of the most important things have happened? What are the most important forms of progress, growth, change? How are you different from who you were at the beginning of September? Maybe in how you define success. Maybe you've let go of things that you were attached to at the beginning of September. I have. One being the story about my dad, but also other huge things that maybe I would have thought were impossible to let go of. As my vision of my future self gets bigger, my filter is getting much higher, and it's always the future that filters the present, and the present that filters the past. So what is different about you, about your life, versus September 1st, 29 or 30 days ago? 40 more seconds. What has happened in September? If you're beginning to operate more and more from your future, probably a lot has happened. And if you really think about it, and remember, it's the present that filters the past, if you develop mastery over your past, you will start to see and create more growth in the last month than maybe you experienced in the last 5 years. All right, last one. This is the last one, I promise. What's the biggest change in growth you've experienced since Monday? How are you different from who you were at the beginning of this week? What has actually happened? What has actually occurred that maybe you weren't expecting? What's now possible that wasn't possible at the beginning of the week? How has your definition of success changed? How has your filter changed in terms of what you'll say yes to and what you'll say no to? How are you different from who you were at the beginning of this week? The more you develop mastery over your past, the more you will be able to see and create change even on a 24-hour period of time. I'm not going to give you that one, although I sometimes do. But you will be able to quickly see, even on a daily basis, that you're not the same person you were at the beginning of the day. "30 more seconds. As you write down the important forms of progress and the important wins you've had, even this week, by actually making them explicit, by writing them down, you are creating change. As the quote said, we reconstruct our memory from the present. So you are actually creating your past right now. You're framing it and you're filtering it. You're creating the identity of your past self and your present self. 10 more seconds. So to get things rolling on the difference between 10x versus 2x. 2x, as an idea, is a very linear pathway. It's sequential. You take what has happened in the past and use that in the present, and you use the present to do more of it in the future. That is what 2x is, as an idea. It's operating from the past and into the present, and it's using the present to create the future. One of my favorite psychologists, his name is Dr. Daniel Gilbert. He gave a TED Talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. And one of the things he said in that talk is that the person you are right now is as fleeting as the present moment. The challenge, though, is that we often take who we are in the moment and we project that off onto our future self. So this is the inaccurate way and also the very ineffective way to operate in time, to take the present and use the present to create your future. to filter the future through the present. The present is shaky. The present is always changing. And so that is not firm ground for creating your future. The future is much firmer ground for creating your present. You want to take your future, you want to imagine your future. As Albert Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge, and you want to let your future be the filter for your choices in the present. A lot of research on this, a lot of research by Daniel Gilbert, a lot of research by a guy named Dr. Hal Hershfield at UCLA. There are 3 levels that you ultimately want to go through in order to do this. Level 1, thinking. You have to actually imagine your future self. Start thinking about your future self. Who is it you want to be in 10 years from now? One of the things I would invite you to do is that whatever view you do have of your future self, even 10 years from now, make it 10 times bigger. This is where I get into some of the ideas from Dr. Oh my goodness. Our man in the stage. He's here. Who is he? Come on. What did I say? Your name will come to me. I'm so sorry. I love you. He's here. I mentioned him like 20 minutes ago. Alan Bernard! All right, so here is where Alan Bernard's ideas come in. If you are going for linear growth, sorry, Alan, I love you, man. I was in a meeting with Alan, and he told me this. We were asked the question, how would you grow your business by 10%? 10%. And he stopped us in the conversation. He said, this is a horrible question. Why? Because there are literally infinite things you can do to grow by 10%. It is so small, so sequential that most of what you're doing now will look the same at 10%. In fact, only 90% will be the same. And so he said it's much better to ask, how would you grow your income by 10 times? Why? Because 10 times is so big, seemingly impossible. And he actually even has done research on this, that impossible goals are a lot better of a filter than small goals. Because to go for something impossible, almost nothing you're doing right now will work, which makes it very effective. Almost nothing you're doing right now will get you to 10x, which makes it a very powerful filter for the present. So those 3 things. And then I'm going to go into the 10x versus 2x model. You want to think about your future self. You want to imagine your future self. You also want to view your future as a draft, like the draft of a book. Remember, who you are in the present is fundamentally based on how you filter and how you frame your past and how you filter and how you frame your future. Those 2 things equal who you're being right now. Being who you are being. So first you have to think about your future self. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Then you have to get insanely emotionally connected to your future self. That's the research from Dr. Hal Hershfield. Once you get so committed, so connected to your future self, then you stop operating as your present self. Then your future genuinely becomes your identity. That's when you reach the place of emotional commitment. Once you go from thinking, you go to feeling, then you get to the place of knowing. Knowing that what you want is already yours because that's how you're operating in the world. That's when you start being your future self now. That's when you start filtering the present from the future. And if you are connected to your future self, especially emotionally, then you will be filtering the present from that. And if the future is 10x, then the filter is so intense that you can be a lot more honest in your life right now about what is signal and what is noise. And if the future is 10x, then as I will show you in a second, at least 80% of what you're doing right now is more a reflection of your past self, not your future self, which is beautiful. All of that stuff is what got you here, but it is not what got you there. So this is that model. This is the 10x versus 2x model. Me and Dan wrote this book together. This is the 3rd book in our trilogy. And so if you are going for 2x growth on this side, if you're going for 2x growth in anything, remember, what that means is you are operating from the present and you're using the present to create the future. You are filtering the future from the present. That's the opposite of what you want to do. You want to filter the present from the future. But if you're going for 2x, you can mostly just continue what you're already doing now. In fact, as it shows, you can keep 80% of your existing life. My books have sold 1 million copies, plus if I wanted to double that, I really can keep 80% of my existing strategy. Probably even 80% of my existing team, 80% of my existing identity. 2x is already happening. You just have to change by 20%. The filter is not that intense with a 2x goal. Just as Alan Bernard said, with going for 10% or even 2x, the filter is not that intense because the present and the future look too similar. And so if you're using the future to filter the present, but it's very linear, you can't filter what is actually signal from noise. The 80-20 rule says 80% of your results comes from the 20%. But if you're creating the future from the present, then that future looks too much like the present. And so you can keep 80% of your present and just keep doing that in the future. So 2x is a fundamentally flawed approach to time. It is not how time works psychologically. It's also a terrible filter for making decisions. You can't know what is effective and what is not. Per Alan Bernard, you can't find the few things that have the highest upside. You can't find those 20% of things because it's not a fine enough filter. 10x is the opposite. 10x is a goal that is so big, so seemingly impossible, that nothing you're doing right now will work. Nothing will work. Well, some of them will, but you have to find those few things that would work. And then you have to get 10 times better and deeper at them. This goes to the idea of attention. That right now, your attention is too broad. Your goals are too broad. What you're saying yes to right now is not a high enough filter. You're still saying yes to too many things, which equals a very low floor. Your floor is massive compared to your past self. Your floor is insane compared to your past self. And that has to be celebrated, 100%. In the present, you shape the meaning of the past. But your floor is very low compared to your future self, especially your 10x future self. And if you begin making that your standard, remember, identity is your story and your standard, or your framing and your filter. And so when you start making that your filter, and you look at the present from that filter, you start to become a lot more honest with yourself. In the Alcoholics Anonymous framework, one of my favorite quotes, all progress starts by telling the truth. It is very hard to tell the truth if you don't have a strong filter. What you ultimately want is you want to take your 10x goal and use that as the filter for the present and acknowledge that most of what you're doing right now won't get you there. Most of what you're doing right now got you here and is fantastic, but it's good, not great. And as my mentor said, Ben, you're good. Maybe you're in the middle of good to great, but you're still holding on to those lesser goals. To restate, we are kept from our goal, not by obstacles, but by a clear path to lesser goals. Everything in the 80% on this graph, on the 10x side, is maintained out of emotional security. That is what that represents. The 80% represents security. You're holding on to it, whether it's keeping those types of clients, keeping that type of business, staying in those types of relationships, maintaining those habits, scrolling social media. You're doing that because it's emotionally secure. You've gotten very good at it. You have mastery over your 80%. You've spent a lot of time doing that 80%. That may even make up your bread and your butter. But if you want to go 10x and you want to have the higher filter, only a few things realistically will get you there, and you're going to have to get very good at those. You're going to have to get so good at those. Let me give an example of myself, and I'll give an example of a company that I advise that does a couple $100 million a year, but wants to get to $1 billion in the next 3. As for myself, back in 2015, I was in the first year of my PhD program. And that is when I started to get really serious about my 10x goal, which was to become a professional author. And more specifically, to get a 6-figure book deal with one of the major publishers. That was a 10x goal because 1% of authors get 6-figure book deals. But I really, really wanted that for multiple reasons. And by the way, 10x is based on what you want. Again, all progress starts by telling the truth. No one else is your future self. Once you start approaching it with intrinsic motivation, and once you get deeply emotionally committed to your future self, you stop worrying about what people think. And also you know that no matter what happens, you get to determine the meaning of it because you own your past. It doesn't own you. So what happened was I got insanely committed to my goal. 6-figure book deal, one of the major publishers. That then invited me to a very intense filter. My 20% back then. Back in 2015, my 20% very clearly, I talked to a bunch of agents, I talked to a bunch of editors, professional authors. They said, Ben, you need to have 100,000 emails. By the way, that did ultimately lead me to studying Russell Brunson's book. And I did get hundreds of thousands of emails. But my 20% was, you need a huge audience, you need a blog, you need huge recognition, you need blogs on Forbes, Fast Company, like we need to know who you are. I was talking to agents and stuff, they're like, Ben, you don't even have a website. And so it was an impossible goal. And if you're not going for something that you believe to be impossible, then you are operating from your past. That is another thing that Bernard taught me. Until you go for something that's impossible, if you are going for something that you believe to be possible, then you think you know how to do it. Therefore, you're operating from your past. So it was an impossible goal for me, as a PhD student, as a foster parent of 3 kids, and that was a huge part of my why, was to get a 6-figure book deal before I finished my PhD. The 20% of that was blogging and growing a massive platform, and I did go 10x. I got 10 times better. My blogs were read by 100 million plus people. I was the top blogger in the world on medium.com, and I blew it up. And I did go 10x. I got that book deal. But then, as my new 10x future self, the future changed. Every time you do this, you go through this process again. And going 10x is about quality, not quantity. I was a different person now as a professional author with a big audience. I had gone through so much change. I was not my past self. Going for 2x is equivalent to trying to crawl faster. And I had twins, and one of them learned how to walk like 3 or 4 months before the other one. So one of them was running and the other one was crawling. Going for 2x is like trying to crawl faster. Going for 10x is learning how to walk. There's a fundamental difference between walking and crawling. There's a fundamental difference between horse and buggy and car. There's a fundamental difference between CDs and iPods and iPhones. Going 10x is about the quality, change, and difference that then opens up all possibilities. But because I had gone 10x, now my future self, the future that's filtering my present, was different. It was, how can I write books that can be amazing for people like you? And so therefore, blogging, the thing that I had developed mastery on for 2.5 years, I could keep doing that, but that would be equivalent to crawling faster. Now I need to learn how to walk. And so blogging went from my 20% to my 80%. It was now my past self, not my future self. I'm stoked about my past self, I'm happy about my past self, but it's the future that filters the present, not the great past. Happens again and again. You always let your future filter your present. Let me give a quick story of this company. Then I'm going to give you a really great example of my son Caleb, who is an amazing tennis player, so that you can see it. And then we'll wrap it up. So there's a company that I'm currently advising, and they are doing $200 million a year in revenue. It's a franchise company. They do flooring. I've actually had them do my carpet. And I started talking to the CEO. The CEO is very committed that he wants to get the company to $1 billion in revenue in the next 7 years. And he hired me to come and train him and his leadership team. I told him, Tom, 7 years is too far away. That's not a fine enough filter to start forcing powerful decisions in the present. Your floor is not going to go up high enough. So in his company, it's a franchise company. If you're thinking about the 80 and the 20 of his franchisees that are making 80% of the revenue of the company, they're about 2 million. They have companies, individual companies, all over the United States, doing 2 million a year in revenue. 80% of these franchisees get stuck between 500,000 and 800,000 in revenue. So that's just where they get stuck. That's where most of them are. And so in our conversations, we said, well, he said, but with my help, the goal is not 7 years. The goal is basically 3 years. And what must be true if we're a $1 billion company in 3 years? Well, they had to massively raise the floor. Right now, the floor and the filter are not going to get them there. So we realized and we determined that the floor had to be $2 million. That within the first year of any new franchisee coming in, their company had to help that franchisee get to $2 million in the first year, or else they weren't doing it right. That's the new filter, that's the new standard, that's their new system and process. That's the new floor. And all of those 80% of people who can't get up to that 2 million mark in the first 12 months, they're probably going to get filtered out. That's what happens with the 80% if you're committed to 10x. The 80% eventually gets filtered out, and you get better and better. In this company, there's one person, one franchisee that has a $10 million a year business. They realize that to go 10x in the next 3 months, or in the next 3 years, there need to be at least 25 individual franchisees that have a 10 million company. So now they know. Now they know their floor, now they know their ceiling, now they know their focus. Now they have a much better filter. They can't let any new people in who are not absolutely committed to 2 million in the first 12 months. And so now they're going to start saying no to a lot of the people that they were going to say yes to. So you have to get clear on the vision, and it should be an impossible goal. That makes intense filters for the new floor, the new ceiling. Last story, probably. And thank you all, thank you all. Is this helpful? Always remember, with the psychology of time, we have been taught that the past determines the present and the present determines the future. In the psychology of time, the past, present, and future all are existing right now. It's based on how you're framing and filtering those, and it should always be the future that filters the present, and the present that filters and frames and determines the past. So this is my son Caleb. He is an amazing tennis player, 15 years old, and his coach recently had a conversation with him. This was when I was writing 10X, and so this was last December. But the coach asked him this question. Caleb, what is your goal? He said this, my goal is to go to college. His coach said, why not pro? When something seems impossible, you don't even think about it. Thinking, feeling, knowing. Once you start thinking about the impossible, then you start strategizing it, and you find that there might be pathways to getting there. But remember, impossible goals have less paths, which makes them a very good filter. So when we're driving home from this conversation with this coach, I just asked him the question. I said, Caleb, I'm not the one who's going to set your goal. But I just want to know, do you think that you actually can get to college? Like, let's be honest. Do you think you're on the path to playing in college? And he said, I don't know. He said, I think so. I said, I'm pretty sure, but I don't know. I said, what about pro? I said, are you on the path to going pro? And it was immediate. It was obvious. He said, no, not even close. There are kids that are like 10 years old who are ridiculous in tennis, right? So we live here in Orlando, and Orlando is somewhat of a tennis mecca. And so here in Orlando, there are likely hundreds, if not thousands, of options, of pathways to getting my son to the college level. He could play high school. He could play for almost any high school in Orlando and likely get to some form of college. There's hundreds of coaches, hundreds of academies. Main point here is that there are a lot of pathways to getting to that goal. But if he genuinely wanted to go pro, most of those pathways that I just described would not get him there. That is too high of a filter, too intense of a standard. If he made that his goal, if he made that his filter for what we made, for the decisions he makes or we make in the present, there might only be a few coaches here in Orlando or even in the United States. But definitely in Orlando, there might be less than 5 that could realistically get him there if that was his goal. Main point, high goals have a high filter. I experienced this while writing this book. This was my 3rd book with Dan Sullivan, my 4th book with Hay House. And once we got the book to a certain level, Hay House was like, it's done, it's beautiful, it's amazing. Dan and his wife Babs, it's amazing, it's beautiful, Ben. You did a great job with 10x is easier than 2x, thank you. And it was as good as my last books, but I did not like it. I knew it was not at the standard I wanted the book to be. I also knew that I did not have the who's to get me there. When the why is strong enough and the filter strong enough, you will find those few pathways, but you'll also find those few who's. Richard Koch has a book on that called The 80-20 Individual. And so I knew that the current filter was not good enough. Everyone around me is saying this book is a 9 or a 10. I know it's not, according to my standards. Maybe to my past self, this is beyond a 10. But to my current self, and I know to my future self, and if my future self is the filter, this book is not there. And none of those people see it. because only I have access to my future self. And so, with a higher goal comes a much more intense filter. It led me to asking some interesting questions, and ultimately I I deeply filtered an editor that I'd already worked with, and that I knew she had worked with some of the biggest authors in the world, some of the biggest books. So I called her and I said, will you look at this book, and will you work with me? So she takes it, reads it, and she says, Ben, this is a 5. She's got a different filter. She's a different who. I said, perfect, you're the person. You are exactly what I'm looking for. She was just dead honest. From her view, it was a 5. And I knew it as well from what I was filtering by, because I was filtering from the future. And so we worked on it, and boom. She said, Ben, we got the book from a 5 to a 9. And so when you have a higher filter, you will also have to find higher quality who's. And as Dan and I talk about in Who Not How, you always view who's as an investment, not a cost. It's an investment in you. Every time you go for that higher goal, every time you go for 10x, whatever that looks like, remember, it's a quality change. It's you going from crawling to walking, whatever that looks like to you. You have to let go. And this is probably the hardest part. You have to let go of what got you here. What got you here won't get you there. The story or the frame of what got you here won't get you there. You have to change your story. You have to operate from your new filter and use that for what you do now. And you have to let go of even things that you thought were impossible. I can tell you there are certain things that you're holding on to right now. They could be addictions. They could be honestly just your business. It could be the type of business you do. It could be how you spend your time in your business. There are certain things that you don't think you can let go of, and that the idea of letting it go terrifies you. Aristotle said that nature abhors a vacuum. That vacuum is empty space. If there is empty space, it will be filled. If you have 5 minutes, you will probably grab your phone and fill the space. So to let go of the 80% is your security blanket. Rather than choosing freedom, which is your future self, you're choosing security, which is your past self. But as you let go of those things, those 80%, as you let go of those, you are evidencing your commitment to your future self, because you can know what your minimum standard is more by what you say no to than by what you say yes to. When you start saying no to those things that you had deep security in, you now know that you are highly committed to your future self. So with the last minute that I have, I want you to go back to your journal. And I want you to write down one thing. What is one or two impossible goals that you will achieve before the end of this year? Before the end of 2023. What is something that you genuinely believe to be impossible, but that you deeply want? Think about that. Write it down. There are 2 ways of looking at this. Something you achieve, or something you let go of. There might be something that you don't think you can let go of in your 80%, that it genuinely feels impossible. I'm not telling you you have to do this, I'm just telling you to write it down. Before the end of the year, what is one impossible goal or 2 that you would like to achieve between now and the end of the year? Take 30 more seconds, just thinking about it. Maybe tonight or some other time in your journal, really think about it. But if you're not going for something that's impossible, you're operating from your past. If you're not going for something that's impossible, then you're not filtering powerfully in the present. And remember, even if you don't hit your goal, you're the one who frames the past. Why would you frame it in a way that makes you feel like a loser? It's always you in the present that shapes your past, and you always want your past to be valuable, powerful. You should have a little bit of fear in even writing this down. It should be like, I don't want to tell people about this. But I do invite you to tell a few people about this, people you can trust, Watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become your actions, habits, character, destiny. If you actually commit to this, and if you make it your filter, you will quickly find the 80% that's slowing you down, and you will start to be far more honest and open to what will get you there. And as you have done before, you have already achieved the impossible many, many times now. That should be your new standard. Everyone, thank you. Have a beautiful day.